an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Lady Catherine Harwood's gloved fingers trembled as she unfolded the Duke of Blackmore's letter, the candlelight casting harsh shadows across his commanding words. Snow battered against the windows of Thornfield Estate as she stood before the stern-faced Duke, his dark eyes revealing nothing, while he waited for her response to the marriage proposal she never wanted. Catherine's breath formed small clouds in the chilled library air while she watched him turn away, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his formal attire. In the frost-covered conservatory weeks later, he uttered those words that silenced her completely. Lie down and think of England. The blizzard that followed would trap them together in ways neither had anticipated, forcing truths, long buried beneath duty and distance, to surface in the unforgiving winter light. The carriage wheels crunched over the frozen gravel of Thornfield Estate as Lady Catherine Harwood peered through the window at her new home. Gray stone walls rose imposingly against the November sky, neither welcoming nor forbidding, simply waiting like the man she had been promised to. "We have arrived, my lady," her lady's maid murmured, gathering their small parcels as the carriage lurched to a halt. Catherine straightened her spine and adjusted her bonnet. 23 years of proper upbringing had prepared her for this moment, the fulfillment of her family's obligation to the Duke of Blackmore, a distant cousin, and now her betrothed. The great oak doors swung open before she reached them. A line of servants stood in precise formation, and at their head a tall figure dressed in black. Lady Catherine. His voice was deep and measured, carrying across the entrance hall without effort. "Welcome to Thornfield." The Duke of Blackmore was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with sharp features and eyes that assessed her with cool efficiency. He bowed precisely, neither too deep nor too shallow. "Your Grace," she curtsied, keeping her gaze level. "Thank you for your welcome. Mrs. Winters will show you to your chambers. We dine at 7. He gestured to the housekeeper, a transaction completed, as Catherine followed Mrs. Winters up the grand staircase. She felt the Duke's gaze follow her, not with desire or curiosity, but with something resembling confirmation, as though her arrival merely completed a ledger entry in his ordered world. Her rooms were spacious and well-appointed, though lacking in personal touches. A fire had been lit, but the chill of the house seemed to permeate even here. "His Grace has arranged for a modest trousseau," Mrs. Winters said, opening a wardrobe filled with new gowns in subdued colors. "The wedding will be held in the chapel after Christmas. So soon." Catherine's composure slipped momentarily. "The Duke believes in efficiency, my lady. The banns will be read starting Sunday, that evening at dinner, separated by the length of a polished mahogany table." Catherine studied her future husband. He ate with precision, spoke with clarity on estate matters, and asked her exactly 3 questions about her journey. Not once did his expression warm. "I trust you understand why you are here," he said finally, as the dessert plates were cleared. "I understand duty, Your Grace." Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps. "Then we shall manage well enough." He raised his glass slightly. "To duty." "To duty," she echoed, and drank the bitter wine. Days at Thornfield followed a rhythm as predictable as the ticking of the great clock in the entrance hall. The Duke rose at dawn, managed estate business until luncheon, rode the grounds in the afternoon, and retired to his library after dinner. Catherine's presence was required at meals, and in the drawing room for an hour each evening, where they engaged in polite, distant conversation. The first snow came a week after her arrival, transforming the grounds into a pristine white landscape. Catherine watched from her window as the Duke rode out, a solitary dark figure against the snow, straight-backed and unwavering, despite the biting wind. "Does His Grace always ride in such weather?" she asked Mrs. Winters. "The Duke believes routine builds character, my lady. Weather is merely an inconvenience to be overcome." Catherine soon learned the unspoken rules of Thornfield. The West Wing, containing the Duke's private chambers and study, was effectively forbidden to her. The library was shared territory, though he never lingered if she entered. The conservatory, filled with plants from his mother's time, seemed neutral ground where they occasionally acknowledged each other with silent nods. One afternoon, finding herself alone in the library, Catherine ventured to examine the Duke's reading selections: military history, estate management, parliamentary records, all practical. Nothing revealing the man behind the title, only a small collection of poetry, tucked behind larger volumes, suggested something beyond duty. "Do you find my literary tastes lacking, Lady Catherine?" She turned to find him watching from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Not lacking, Your Grace, merely focused. Life requires focus, especially one of responsibility. And does responsibility preclude pleasure?" The question escaped before she could reconsider. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Pleasure is a luxury afforded to those without obligation. We are not such people." "I see." She replaced the book carefully. "Then I shall endeavor to be more focused." That night at dinner, he studied her with new attention. "You were educated at Mrs. Harrington's academy, I understand." "Yes, Your Grace." "And what did they teach you there?" "Everything a lady should know, and perhaps a few things she shouldn't." His eyebrow raised fractionally. "Such as?" "That a woman might have thoughts of her own, even when they contradict a gentleman's." For a moment she thought she glimpsed something like amusement in his eyes, quickly suppressed. A dangerous education indeed. He returned to his meal. "Winter approaches quickly this year. The staff will move your belongings to the East Wing tomorrow. The rooms there are better insulated against the cold." It wasn't consideration, Catherine realized. Merely efficiency, like everything else at Thornfield. 3 weeks after her arrival, Catherine found herself in the conservatory, sketching the exotic plants that thrived. Despite the frost creeping up the glass panes, the space felt almost warm compared to the rest of Thornfield, heated by coal furnaces beneath the stone floor. The Duke entered silently, stopping when he noticed her presence. "I apologize for disturbing you," she said, beginning to gather her materials. "No need." He gestured for her to remain seated. "The conservatory belongs to the estate, not to me alone." It was perhaps the most personal statement he had made since her arrival. Catherine watched as he examined a flowering orchid with unexpected gentleness. "My mother cultivated these," he said, not looking at her. "They require precise conditions to thrive." "Like most living things," Catherine ventured. He glanced at her sharply. "Some thrive on discipline rather than indulgence." "Is that what you believe marriage to be, Your Grace? A matter of discipline?" His posture stiffened. "Marriage is a contract, an arrangement of mutual benefit and obligation, and nothing more?" The Duke turned fully toward her, his expression hardening. "Lady Catherine, let us be clear. Ours will be a marriage of convenience. I require an heir. Your family requires the connection to my title. Beyond that," he paused, choosing his words with precision, "beyond that, I expect little from you except discretion and obedience." Catherine felt her cheeks flush. "And if I expect more, then you will be disappointed." His voice lowered, becoming almost gentle in its finality. "When the time comes, lie down and think of England. That is all that will be required of you." The words hung between them, clinical and cold. Catherine felt something within her go silent, not broken, but contained, like water frozen beneath ice. "I see." She closed her sketchbook with careful movements. "Thank you for your honesty, Your Grace." That night, the first true storm of winter descended upon Thornfield. Wind howled around the stone corners, rattling windows and sending drafts through hallways. Catherine lay awake, listening to the tempest, feeling it echo the turbulence within her. In the morning, snow had transformed the world. Drifts piled against doors and windows, sealing them inside. Footmen reported the roads impassable. The estate cut off from the village. "We are isolated," the Duke announced at breakfast, "perhaps for weeks." Catherine met his gaze across the table. "How unfortunate," she said quietly, "for us both." The blizzard transformed Thornfield's carefully ordered existence. With half the servants' quarters rendered uninhabitable by a collapsed roof, the Duke was forced to consolidate the household into the main wing. Fires were maintained only in essential rooms to conserve coal, bringing the inhabitants into closer quarters than propriety typically allowed. "We must adapt to circumstances," the Duke informed Catherine as they stood in the great hall, watching footmen carry furniture from unused rooms. The blue drawing room will serve as our common area. I've instructed Mrs. Winters to move your personal items there temporarily. And where will you be, Your Grace? Catherine asked, noting how the storm had disheveled him slightly, a lock of dark hair falling across his forehead. My study has been compromised by a broken window. I will work in the library. He hesitated. We will necessarily see more of each other in these conditions. I shall endeavor not to disturb your routine. Something like frustration crossed his features. This is not about routine, Lady Catherine. It is about survival. Thornfield was not built for comfort, but for defense. In winter, it becomes a fortress against the elements. That afternoon, Catherine Severn discovered the Duke in the kitchen, deep in conversation with the cook about rationing provisions. He had removed his formal jacket. His shirt sleeves rolled to reveal strong forearms as he examined inventory lists. He looked up, momentarily startled by her presence. Lady Catherine, I came to offer my assistance, she said. I managed my father's household for 3 years before his death. I have some experience with challenging circumstances. The Duke studied her, reassessing. Very well. We need to inventory the root cellar and preserve what might spoil if the ice house fails. They worked side by side for hours, their breath visible in the cold storage rooms. Catherine noted how the Duke addressed each servant by name, how he lifted the heaviest crates himself, rather than delegating. You surprise me, he said quietly as they checked the last of the preserves. Because I'm willing to soil my hands with practical matters? Because you do so without complaint. He straightened, looking directly at her. Many ladies of your standing would consider such work beneath them. Survival is never beneath anyone, Catherine replied. And I find usefulness preferable to ornamental idleness. For the first time, the Duke's lips curved in what might almost be called a smile. On that, Lady Catherine, we are in perfect agreement. A week into their snowbound confinement, Catherine woke in the night to the smell of smoke, not the comforting scent of hearth fires, but the acrid burn of paper. Heart-pounding, she wrapped her robe around her nightgown and followed the smell to the library. The door stood ajar, firelight flickering within. Catherine peered inside to see the Duke kneeling before the hearth, feeding documents into the flames. His face, usually so composed, was taut with some unnamed emotion as he watched the papers curl and blacken. She must have made some small sound, for he turned sharply. Lady Catherine, forgive me, she said, stepping back. I smelled smoke and feared. No fire beyond what's contained. He rose in one fluid motion, placing himself between her and the hearth. You should return to your room. But Catherine had glimpsed the nature of the papers. Legal documents with elaborate seals. Are those estate matters? The Duke's jaw tightened. They are personal. I see. She didn't move. Is everything well, Your Grace? He studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. Not all decisions age well with time, Lady Catherine. Some papers represent obligations that, perhaps, should not have been made. Yet you hesitate to destroy them completely, she observed, noting how he had pulled several documents from the flames before they were consumed. The Duke looked at the rescued papers in his hand, his expression softening into something like regret. Some duties survive us, others must end. The intimacy of the moment, his disheveled appearance, the lateness of the hour, the raw emotion in his voice, made Catherine acutely aware of their isolation in the silent house, with snow pressing against the windows. They existed outside the normal constraints of society. Would you like me to leave? She asked quietly. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw uncertainty there. That would be proper. Proper, she repeated. But is it what you wish? The Duke's hand tightened on the papers. What I wish has rarely been relevant to what must be done. Catherine took a step forward, close enough to feel the heat from the fire. Perhaps in a house buried in snow, with no one to observe or judge, what you wish might matter more than what is proper. For a heartbeat, something vulnerable crossed his face, a longing so quickly suppressed, she might have imagined it. Then he straightened, composure returning like a mask sliding into place. Good night, Lady Catherine. She recognized the dismissal in his tone. Good night, Your Grace. As she closed the door, She glimpsed him returning the rescued documents to a locked box rather than the fire, his movements careful, almost tender. The days of isolation began to reveal the Duke in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated. She observed him through doorways and across rooms, cataloging the man behind the title. She noticed how he spent an hour each morning reading to Mrs. Winters, whose eyesight was failing, but whose pride prevented her from admitting it. How he personally ensured the youngest kitchen maid received an extra blanket when the temperature dropped further. How he worked alongside the footmen to clear snow from the essential pathways, refusing to ask of others what he wouldn't do himself. These glimpses came in fragments. The Duke replacing a book on a high shelf for a housemaid too short to reach. His quiet conversation with the elderly gardener who worried about his dormant plants. The way he absently stroked the estate cat when he thought no one was watching. None of these actions were performed for show. Indeed, he seemed almost embarrassed when Catherine witnessed them. They were simply the instinctive movements of a man who, beneath his rigid exterior, understood responsibility as care rather than merely authority. One evening, finding the blue drawing room empty, Catherine wandered to the library. The door was open, and inside, the Duke sat reading by firelight, his formal posture relaxed in solitude. On the small table beside him lay a volume of poetry. Wordsworth, she noted, open to lines written in early spring. She must have made some sound, for he looked up, closing the book quickly as though caught in some impropriety. Lady Catherine, I didn't mean to disturb your reading. He glanced at the poetry volume, then back to her. It was merely a diversion from accounts. Wordsworth is a lovely diversion, she said, entering the room fully. Though I wouldn't have guessed him to be to your taste. Something like defiance flickered in his eyes. Because you believe me incapable of appreciating beauty? Because you've worked so diligently to present yourself as concerned only with practicalities. The Duke was silent for a moment. Perhaps I have. Catherine took a seat across from him, bold in this new understanding. Why? He studied her, weighing something internally. Beauty, emotion. These are luxuries that complicate duty, and duty must remain clear. Must it? She asked softly. Cannot duty and feeling coexist? That, said the Duke, his voice low, is precisely what I have spent years avoiding discovering. 2 weeks into their snowbound isolation, an unexpected arrival disrupted Thornfield's newfound rhythm. Lady Willoughby, the Duke's maternal aunt, appeared at the door with her driver and companion, having braved the partially cleared roads from the neighboring estate. Blackmore. One cannot allow a little snow to interrupt family obligation, she declared, sweeping into the hall in a flurry of furs and perfume. Her sharp eyes immediately found Catherine. And this must be the bride. Let me look at you, girl. Catherine endured the elderly woman's inspection with practiced grace. Lady Willoughby turned to her nephew with an approving nod. Well chosen, Blackmore. Pretty enough without being vain, I should think, and from good stock, despite the family's recent difficulties. The Duke's expression remained impassive. Lady Catherine has been a most adaptable guest during our unfortunate confinement. Guest? Lady Willoughby raised an eyebrow. Still maintaining separate chambers, then? Well, propriety has its place, I suppose. Though in my day, we understood that securing the succession took precedence over such niceties. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks as the Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. At dinner, Lady Willoughby dominated the conversation with family gossip and pointed inquiries about wedding preparations. The Duke answered with minimal courtesy, his discomfort evident only to Catherine, who had learned to read the subtle tensions in his posture. I must say, Catherine, Lady Willoughby remarked over dessert, you're fortunate that Blackmore has mellowed with age. He was excessively severe about women's obedience in his youth, positively medieval in his pronouncements. Why, I remember when he arranged his ward's marriage. Aunt. The Duke's voice cut through her chatter like ice. Lady Catherine has no interest in ancient history. Lady Willoughby blinked, then smiled knowingly. Of course not. Though I dare say she'll discover your expectations soon enough. The silence that followed was deafening. The Duke did not contradict his aunt, did not defend himself against the characterization. He merely continued eating with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on his plate. Later, as Catherine prepared for bed, she found herself dwelling on Lady Willoughby's words and the Duke's telling silence. The man who had told her to lie down and think of England was the same who had been excessively severe about women's obedience. Yet this aligned poorly with the man she had observed these past weeks, the one who rescued documents from flames and read poetry in private. Something didn't fit, and Catherine was determined to understand what. The morning after Lady Willoughby's departure, Catherine found the Duke in the conservatory, examining a wilting orchid with concern. He looked up at her approach, his expression guarded. "I fear we're losing some of the more delicate specimens to the cold," he said, touching a yellowing leaf. "Even the coal furnaces cannot maintain the proper temperature in such weather." Catherine moved closer, noting how the plant leaned toward what little sunlight filtered through the frosted glass. Perhaps they need to be moved closer to the house fires. That would mean removing them from their established positions. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "what has always been done is not what should continue to be done." His eyes met hers, and she knew they were no longer discussing plants. "You refer to my aunt's indiscreet comments." "I refer to many things, Your Grace, including, lie down and think of England." The Duke straightened, his fingers leaving the orchid. "I owe you an apology for that phrase. It was unworthy. Yet it reflected your expectations. It reflected what I was taught," he corrected, his voice low. "What was expected of me as much as of any bride." Catherine studied him, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "And what do you expect now, having spent these weeks in closer quarters?" He turned away, moving toward the window, where ice patterns formed intricate designs. "I find my expectations evolving, as do mine." Catherine took a deep breath. "Your Grace." "Edward," he interrupted. "My name is Edward." The simple offering of his Christian name hung between them, more intimate than any physical gesture. "Edward," she repeated softly. "I believe we may have misjudged each other from the beginning." "How so?" "You saw me as merely fulfilling an obligation. I saw you as cold and authoritarian. Perhaps we are both more complex than our assigned roles." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps we are." That afternoon, Catherine found a book of poetry placed outside her door. Wordsworth, open to a page marked with a pressed orchid blossom. The poem was "She was a phantom of delight," with its final stanza underlined. A perfect woman, nobly planned, to warn, to comfort, and command. And yet a spirit still, and bright with something of angelic light. It was not a declaration of love, but it was acknowledgement of worth, of seeing her as more than duty required. And in that moment, Catherine realized that her feelings for the Duke, for Edward, had shifted into something she had not anticipated nor prepared for. The library became their sanctuary in the evenings, with much of the house closed to conserve heat. They found themselves sharing the space after dinner, initially in silence, then in cautious conversation that gradually deepened as the nights progressed. "What did you study at university?" Catherine asked one evening. Curled in the armchair opposite his, Edward looked up from his book, surprised by her interest. "Law primarily, and some natural philosophy, not poetry." A slight smile touched his lips. "Poetry was my private rebellion. My father considered it unsuitable for the future Duke of Blackmore." "And what did you consider suitable for yourself?" He was silent for a moment, considering. "I wanted to reform agricultural practices on the estate, to improve conditions for the tenants." "Have you?" "Some, not enough." His gaze grew distant. "Duty often supersedes innovation." On another night, he asked about her childhood, listening with genuine interest as she described her father's progressive views on female education. "He believed minds should not be wasted, regardless of gender," she explained. "When my mother died, he saw no reason to hire a governess when he could teach me himself." "That explains much about you," Edward observed. "Does it displease you?" "My unconventional upbringing." He considered her question seriously. "Once perhaps it would have. Now I find it refreshing." The most revealing conversation came during a particularly bitter night, when the wind howled like a living thing against the windows. They had moved their chairs closer to the fire, and closer to each other. Do you believe in love within marriage? Catherine asked suddenly, watching the firelight play across his features. Edward's hands stilled on the book in his lap. I believe in respect, in partnership. That isn't what I asked. He met her gaze directly. I believe love is a luxury not all are permitted to consider, because of duty, because of consequences. His voice softened. Decisions made from emotion can harm those who depend on rational judgment. Catherine leaned forward. And if emotion and reason align, if duty and desire point to the same path, something vulnerable flickered in his eyes. Then one would be fortunate indeed. And are you fortunate, Edward? The silence between them hummed with unspoken possibilities. Finally, he set his book aside and stood, moving to stoke the fire. I'm beginning to wonder, he said quietly, his back to her, if I might be. The thaw began gradually. First the icicles dripped from eaves, then pathways emerged from beneath snow, with the roads partially cleared. Edward announced he must ride to the village to address urgent estate matters. Catherine, restless after weeks of confinement, ventured into the west wing for the first time. Most rooms stood empty and cold, but at the corridor's end, a door stood ajar. Inside, she found a small sitting room, preserved like a museum piece, a young woman's chamber, with faded watercolors on the walls, and a writing desk, positioned by the window. Her name was Clara. Catherine turned to find Edward in the doorway, snow melting from his greatcoat. His expression was unreadable. Your ward, she said, understanding dawning. The one your aunt mentioned. He nodded, entering the room slowly. My father's goddaughter. When he died, her guardianship passed to me. She was 17. What happened to her? Edward's fingers traced the edge of the writing desk. I arranged her marriage to Lord Pembroke, a man 40 years her senior, rigid in his expectations, but wealthy and titled. I believed I was securing her future. And were you? His eyes, when they met hers, contained a pain she had never witnessed before. He broke her spirit within a year. By the time I understood what I had done, she was beyond my help. She died in childbirth 3 years later. Catherine felt the weight of his confession. You were young yourself. Old enough to know better. Old enough to see her as a duty to be discharged rather than a person with her own desires. His voice hardened. I swore after her death that I would never again use a woman's obedience as a tool of convenience. That I would never command where I should instead ask. Understanding flooded Catherine. His formality, his distance, his reluctance to exercise authority over her, despite their arrangement. It had never been coldness, but penance. That night in the library, she said softly, the papers you burned. Clara's marriage contract, and those I saved. Were her letters, Catherine finished. You keep them as a reminder. Edward nodded, his composure slipping for the first time since she had known him. Some duties survive us, the duty to remember, to do better. Catherine moved toward him, close enough to feel the cold still emanating from his coat. And is our marriage to be part of your penance? No, he said quietly. That is what I am trying to ensure it never becomes. The following days brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Edward no longer maintained the rigid formality that had characterized their early interactions. He asked rather than instructed, suggested rather than decided. Catherine, in turn, found herself speaking more freely, expressing opinions she might once have kept silent. They walked the grounds together as the snow receded, discussing changes to the estate that would benefit the tenants. Edward listened to her suggestions with genuine consideration, implementing several immediately. You have a natural understanding of people's needs, he remarked, as they surveyed a tenant cottage he had ordered repaired to her specifications. Perhaps because I've experienced what it means to fall from security, she replied. After my father died, before the arrangement with your family was made, I lived with my uncle. He made quite clear that my presence was a burden. Edward's expression darkened. I did not know. It wasn't included in the settlement papers, Catherine said with a small smile, just as Clara's letters weren't included in hers. One morning, Catherine entered the breakfast room to find Edward reviewing correspondence with unusual intensity. He looked up, his expression troubled. A letter from your uncle, he said, inquiring when the wedding will take place. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I see. He expresses concern about the propriety of our prolonged isolation together. He expresses concern about when he will receive the financial settlement, she corrected quietly. Edward set the letter down. Catherine, I must ask you something, and I require absolute honesty. She nodded, her heart quickening. Do you wish to marry me? The directness of the question took her breath away. I. Not out of duty or obligation or fear of your uncle's household. Do you, Catherine Harwood, wish to become my wife? She studied his face, the face she had come to know in all its expressions, from stern authority to quiet vulnerability. I don't know, she answered honestly. I know I no longer fear it. I know I respect you, and I believe you respect me. But marriage should perhaps be more than mutual respect. Something like pain crossed his features, quickly suppressed. I agree. He stood formal once more. I will make arrangements for your return to London. You will have an allowance sufficient to establish yourself independently of your uncle. You need not fear dependency again. Edward, I promised myself I would never again consign a woman to a marriage of mere obligation. His voice was gentle but firm. Not even when keeping that promise costs me dearly. Catherine watched him leave, understanding with sudden clarity that in offering her freedom, Edward had revealed the depth of his feelings more eloquently than any declaration of love. The day before Catherine's scheduled departure, she sought Edward in the conservatory. Snow had begun falling again, delicate flakes that caught on the glass panes and melted slowly, creating rivulets like tears down the windows. He stood among the orchids. Many now revived under his careful attention. Without turning, he spoke. I've arranged everything. The carriage will take you to London tomorrow, weather permitting. And if I don't wish to go... Now he turned, his expression guarded. Catherine, you asked if I wished to marry you out of duty, she said, moving closer. But you never asked if I might wish to marry you for other reasons. What other reasons could there be, after how our arrangement began, after what I said to you? Catherine stopped before him, close enough to see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. Lie down and think of England, she quoted softly. Those words silenced me once, words I deeply regret. Yet they were not yours originally. They were given to you, just as duty was given to you. She reached for his hand, finding it cold. Edward, I've watched you these weeks. I've seen how you carry guilt for Clara, how you try to atone through kindness, you hide beneath sternness. I've seen the man beneath the Duke. His fingers tightened around hers. And what man do you see? One who has learned from his mistakes, one who values freedom enough to offer it even at personal cost. Edward looked down at their joined hands. I was taught that a duke commands. That authority is never questioned. And now, he raised his eyes to hers. Lie down and think of England, he repeated, then shook his head. I was taught that was duty. I know now it was fear. The confession hung between them, stripped of all pretense. Fear of what? Catherine whispered. Of vulnerability. Of allowing another person close enough to matter. His voice dropped lower. Of wanting something for myself rather than for Thornfield, or the title, or the bloodline. Catherine stepped closer still. And what do you want, Edward? Not the Duke, not the guardian, not the heir. What do you want? The conservatory was silent, except for the soft patter of snow against glass. Edward slowly removed his gloves, laying them on the stone bench beside them. A gesture of vulnerability she understood immediately. Stay, he said simply, his voice stripped of all authority. Catherine, stay. Stay. The word hung between them, neither command nor plea, but something entirely new, a request between equals. Catherine looked at Edward's bare hands, strong and slightly calloused from the work he never delegated. Hands that had signed documents of duty and authority, now exposed in their humanity. If I stay, she said carefully, what would it mean? That we begin again. Edward's voice was steady, though his exposed hands trembled slightly, not as Duke and promised bride, but as Edward and Catherine. That we discover what might exist between us without obligation driving us. And if what exists isn't enough, then you would still have your freedom and independence. I would ensure it. Catherine studied his face, seeing the cost of this vulnerability in the tension around his eyes. You're afraid, she realized. A small, rueful smile touched his lips, terrified. The great Duke of Blackmore, terrified of a simple country girl. Not of you, he corrected. Of failing you, of becoming the man who once told a woman to lie down and think of England. Catherine reached for his bare hand, her gloved fingers entwining with his. That man is already gone, Edward. I watched him disappear, piece by piece, as the snow melted. He drew a sharp breath at her touch. Catherine, I will stay, she said. Not out of duty to my family or fear of my uncle or obligation to your title. I will stay because I choose to. Because I want to discover what exists between Catherine and Edward. Something transformed in his face, a lightening, as though a burden carried too long had finally been set down. Slowly, with deliberate care, he raised her gloved hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers. Thank you, he whispered against her hand. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but within the conservatory, surrounded by plants that had survived the harshest winter, Catherine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coal furnaces beneath the floor. It came from choice freely made, from possibility rather than obligation, from the simple, profound knowledge that she was exactly where she wished to be. Spring came slowly to Thornfield, in small increments rather than grand gestures. First crocuses pushed through melting snow. Then birdsong returned to the awakening trees. Inside, a similar transformation unfolded between Catherine and Edward. They were married quietly in the estate chapel as daffodils bloomed along the pathways. No grand London ceremony, no parade of aristocratic guests, only the household staff, who had weathered the winter with them, and the village residents, who had come to respect the Duke's changing management of the estate. Are you disappointed? Edward asked as they walked the grounds after the ceremony, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Many ladies dream of grander weddings. I've never aspired to be many ladies, Catherine replied, and I find I prefer substance to spectacle. Their first night as husband and wife held none of the clinical distance Edward had once prescribed. Instead, they discovered each other slowly, with wonder and tenderness that deepened into passion neither had anticipated. No thoughts of England entered the room. Only the whispered names of lovers learning each other's hearts as intimately as their bodies. Afterward, Catherine traced the line of his jaw in the firelight. I never thought it could be like this. Nor I. Edward caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I was taught that desire was something to be controlled, never shared. And now, his smile held a freedom she had never seen before. Now I find that sharing is the greater joy. In the library, the next morning, Catherine discovered her glove, left behind from their conversation in the conservatory, placed carefully on the desk. Beside it lay Edward's signet ring, the symbol of his ducal authority. When he entered, she gestured to the items. Should I return your ring? No. He moved to stand behind her, arms encircling her waist. I thought perhaps we might both leave symbols behind occasionally, to remind us that Catherine and Edward exist beyond Duchess and Duke. She leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, beyond England. Far beyond, he murmured against her hair, into territory entirely our own. 1 year after Catherine's arrival at Thornfield, the estate had transformed. Tenant cottages stood repaired. The village school had been expanded, and the great house itself had shed its forbidding atmosphere for one of quiet welcome. The most profound change, however, was in the conservatory, under their joint care. The plants that had nearly perished in winter now flourished, with new specimens added from Catherine's botanical studies. Your mother would be pleased, Catherine said, watching Edward tend to a particularly delicate bloom. Her legacy continues. As does Clara's, he replied softly, though differently than I once imagined. The fund they had established in Clara's name provided dowries for young women who wished to marry for love rather than security. It was, Edward had explained, a way of ensuring no woman under his influence would ever again face the choice Clara had been denied. That evening, as spring rain pattered against the library windows, Catherine sat at the desk, completing correspondence, while Edward read nearby. The comfortable silence between them spoke of intimacy deeper than words. The quiet certainty of two people who had chosen each other deliberately, with clear eyes and open hearts. I've been thinking, Edward said, setting aside his book. Catherine looked up, smiling at the man who had become not just her husband, but her partner in every sense. A dangerous pastime, indeed. His eyes held the warmth that now came naturally to him. I've been thinking about that phrase. She knew immediately which phrase he meant. I believe we've redefined it entirely. He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. Now when I lie down, I think only of you. Catherine cradled his face in her hands, seeing in it all the seasons they had weathered together. The cold authority of their first meeting, the thawing vulnerability of winter's isolation, the blooming trust of spring. As do I, she whispered, bending to kiss him. Only of you.